Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Christoph mentioned, Brent and I are going to spend a little bit of time here sharing some of the outcomes of feedlot questionnaire completed by feed industry advisors that we had on the go last year. And this is a really unique group for the survey. It provides kind of that high level view of the industry and that kind of perspective on the practices adopted across the sector. So this is just a little bit of a background on the survey. So last year, we surveyed feed industry professionals on their experiences and perception related to Ontario's feedlot sector with a real focus on feeding and management practices. So this survey was conducted collaboratively between the Ontario Corn-Fed Beef Program, the Ontario Agribusiness Association, and OMAFRA. And Brent and I are really serving as the spokespeople for our team today. So we had about, the survey was open during May of last year, closed the same month. We had about 43 respondents. I think that probably the chance to win a couple of a box of Ontario corn-fed beef was probably one of the motivators there for participation. So we had 43 respondents, and these respondents represented multiple tiers of the industry. So we had our respondents included those who are in feed sales and consultants, nutritionists, ingredient suppliers, and some animal health advisors as well. So certainly we think there's a lot of opportunities out of these survey results. So certainly they provide a benchmarking opportunity for feed industry folks in terms of their advice given, and also for producers in terms of practices implemented. The results help us collectively identify knowledge gaps and also focus on those practices that benefit cattle feeders. And also acknowledge that there's multiple advisors going on farm. So drawing our attention to this need for communication between advisors as well. Okay, so the next couple slides are really just some basics on our survey respondents. So who they are and the advice that they give on farm. So as part of the study, as part of the survey, we can see here that the vast majority of respondents represent feed reps and nutritionists, acknowledging that there is some overlap in responsibilities between those two categories there. There were a few respondents, so less than 10% from the pharmaceutical, animal health, and feed ingredient supplier categories. So on average, 38% of the client base of survey respondents consisted of beef feedlot producers. So keep in mind that it was a requirement that survey respondents had some feedlot business. What this means is that beef feedlot is not always the primary business for feed industry professionals. And we've seen this kind of feedback at our Ruminant Feed Industry Day days as well. Okay, so this next graph is showing the distribution of feedlot size represented by survey respondents. So this is measured in number of cattle finished per year. Largely what we would expect based on Ontario's feedlot sector, with representation skewed more heavily towards the small and medium-sized feedlots based on our respondents. Okay, and I'm going to turn it over to Brent now to go through the next couple of slides.
Thanks, Megan, and welcome everyone to this webinar. We're really pleased to be able to put some what we feel is some really good information together and present it to Ontario's beef industry. So anyway, in reference to this slide, 56% of the producers use a team approach to manage decisions on the farm with multiple advisors. Team member approach, including advisors for nutrition, financial, cropping, animal health, etc., are really important. It adds a tremendous amount of depth to the management of the producer's operation. Someone looking in without the same emotional ties. It's difficult to have that experience, skill set, and knowledge diversity required to make all the informed, accurate decisions on today's farm operations. This is where a team member can help as a mentor to the producer. Next slide. This was a bit of a surprise to us. This number, 20% of the feed industry professionals take part in closeouts or other production metrics on a feedlot. It may have been taken slightly out of context. This slide states that a small number of our survey respondents are having an active role in calculating a closeout for their clients. In other words, using the information provided by the producers such as dry matter intake, carcass traits, health status, gain, etc., to get a true picture of the cattle's performance. Your feed advisor or veterinarian will have a better understanding of your farm and be able to make more informed decisions and recommendations based on accurate farm data. Remember, it's difficult to improve what you don't measure. Megan?
Okay, so we've kind of parceled the survey out based on the format of the survey itself. So this next section here is focusing on general feeding and management practices of our respondents' clients. Okay, so feedlot operators. And so this slide relates to antibiotic stewardship. So we asked some questions around direct fed antibiotics and any reductions that feed industry professionals are seeing on farms. So the respondents reported that on average that antibiotic use was reduced in 35% of their feedlots over the past 10 years. So it's a promising statistic, but certainly still opportunity for more work here. And certainly any reduction in antibiotic use is supported by better prevention strategies that we're here to talk about tonight. So. Okay, and just going along with that, here we're looking at the average proportion of antibiotic and non-antibiotic feed additives on feedlots serviced by the survey respondents. So we're comparing finishing programs and receiving programs. So blue represents the blue bars that you see here represent newly received cattle. The red bars represent finishing. Not surprisingly, ionophores are used quite ubiquitously across the feedlot sector in both receiving and finishing rations. So the other categories of antibiotics came in a close second here. And the uptake of other non-antibiotic feed additives, including yeast and buffers and prebiotics and probiotics, much lower uptake, reported at 25% or less on average. Okay, Brenton, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So this number, 48% use the feedback from farm records to make management decisions. Again, that number seems a bit low. I was surprised that it wasn't higher. It indicates only half the producers use the farm data to make management decisions. As mentioned previously, your real farm data needs to be used to make decisions on the farm. It's about your farm, and that's the data that you should be using to make management decisions. Records are so important to make good decisions on your farm.
Okay, so what we saw through the survey was that really full-time feeders in the Ontario sector are the minority. So, you know, on average, 56% of feedlot operators represented in the survey have other farm enterprises or off-farm jobs, which means that they're, you know, these feedlot operators have other activities and focuses that take them, you know, out of the barn. And this becomes a really important information especially for feed advisors in terms of gathering intel, what's happening on farm, and also important when applying as a producer, when applying practices on farm as well. So of course, bunk management's been a big focus for our feedlot work over the last couple of years, working collaboratively with the Ontario Corn-Fed Beef Program. We're still seeing very little uptake in bunk management tools to improve bunk management. So the respondents reported that they're seeing on farm that 19% of their producers are using some kind of bunk scoring system. I mean, it could be that some of their clients are checking or reading bunks before feeding, but not necessarily scoring bunks. There is value in those scoring tools and recording them because they can help track and discuss patterns in dry matter intake. And I know Brent's going to talk a little bit more about this on the next slide as well.
Megan, I'd just like to add a little bit to what your comments were to there, Megan. That question was, again, a little somewhat open-ended on an answer standpoint, indicating a small number of producers complying. What's probably happening, producers are looking at the bunk and adjusting up or down in the AM and feeding for that day. That bunk score needs to be recorded to track the consumption trends from a few days prior to be part of the decision-making process going forward. Another consideration is the aggressiveness of the cattle towards the bunk. Ideally, 25% of the cattle should approach the bunk at feeding time. And we observed that with the trail cameras that we've had in place and on the bunk management detail over the past couple of years. And these types of feeding patterns are important to establish. And referring to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, 66% of the producers understand the importance and consistency in feeding times. And again, it's just like milking cows, consistent feeding times are important for the cattle, important for reading the bunk score at the same time each day. I had one producer mention that they score the bunk each morning, and when feeding, they score the aggression of the cattle coming towards the bunk at each feeding. So that's that creates 3 times that the cattle or that bunk is scored for the cattle throughout a day, and then all those records are kept. And then, like I mentioned earlier, they use that data to fine-tune their feeding program and bunk deliveries. Feed push-ups. Push-ups, as we noted in last year's study, that they encourage the cattle to approach the bunk, increase the dry matter intake, and therefore better gains and better performance. We observed that very widely throughout the study again this year, and we've also been working just to touch on that we've been working with robotic feed pushers this past summer and fall, taking a bit of technology from the dairy industry. These are longer term projects, and the data will be summarized at a later date. However, preliminary findings indicate favorable thoughts on dry matter increases. These robots require flat and tabletop alleys to operate, obviously, so looking forward to those results. Grain type and processing. I sort of lumped those two together. The next slide is monitoring, if we want to, monitoring grain particle size and kernel processing. A large percent is done by observation by the look of this graph. That is all fine, but actually knowing the fiber percentage of your ration is key. The particle size of your ration's grain portion will determine the overall ration's fiber level requirements. It's one of those little things you have control over on your farm, and those little things can make a big difference to the performance of the cattle. We will cover this in more detail in the other segment of the webinar. As an example, I was on a trip to a large feedlot in the Liberal, Kansas area a few years back, and we visited a large feedlot running about 40,000 head. They had put up a huge volume of high moisture corn in a bunker that was 200 feet wide and 500 feet long. They ground the high moisture corn so fine going into the bunker that the nutritionist was tearing his hair out trying to accommodate this high moisture corn into their rations. They were experiencing digestive problems and health issues due to this error on their part. So it amazed me how so much corn could be put up the wrong way before anyone noticed. Even the professionals can make mistakes. So there again, pay attention to the details because they matter. Megan?
Thanks, Brent. So Brent kind of just polished off that last parcel of questions there. Moving into the next section, we're looking at specific practices around newly received cattle. We're interested in this critical phase of receiving and starting cattle because the impact of management decisions at this stage the management decisions have an impact on health and performance of cattle for the duration of the feeding period. We're going to certainly have more discussion about that tonight as well, but we'll share some results from the survey here now. So Brent, I think you're on for this one as well.
Yep. So risk assessment for incoming cattle, that's a really strong management point in my opinion. It's so important to have that risk assessment established, protocols in place to handle the class of cattle arriving. This will include a health protocol and a ration protocol. Most feedlots have 3 levels, high, medium, low risk. However, I was speaking with a producer that has 5 risk management categories in place on their feedlot. So how they are started is so important to the whole feeding period. Megan?
So this slide touches on our results pertaining to feeding frequency and then what feed industry advisors reporting in that respect. So this is feeding frequency for newly received cattle. And really what this is reporting on is how often fresh feed is offered to newly received cattle. I think an important takeaway from this slide is that 43% of producers are only feeding newly received cattle once a day, according to the feed advisors who responded to the survey. And certainly our bunk management work from last summer demonstrated that more frequent feeding cattle on feed more consistently. And this is particularly important for newly received cattle. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about this from the producer panelists today as well. Certainly we saw some of the benefits of being very attentive to the bunk for newly received cattle and multiple feeding times in a day to keep cattle on feed. So we also asked about roughage levels because we know that that's another important aspect of starting cattle. So roughage levels and rations. Here the blue line represents the average forage inclusion in the ration for lighter cattle. So that's 5-weight cattle up to 850 pounds. And then the red line here represents the average forage inclusion in the ration for heavier newly received cattle, so 850 pounds plus, kind of in that range. And this data was reported according to weeks after receiving. So where we see 0 there, that represents day 1 of receiving. And we'd expect to see these higher forage inclusion rates upon receiving. And we'd also expect to see these levels of decline with increasing weeks after receiving. And certainly there is a spread maintained for heavier versus lighter cattle. And heavier cattle tend to drop off quicker than lighter in terms of roughage inclusion rate. So this was kind of along the lines that we expected to see. And this next slide here is showing the breakdown of the most commonly used roughage sources and rations for newly received cattle. So here we see kind of a 50-50 split between corn silage and dry hay. Less common are some of the other sources in terms of the leaders there. But some of the less common sources include haylage, straw, and cereal silage. And just a note here that given the high proportion of corn silage, it's really important to think about assessing particle size distribution that can affect rumen health. And we're going to get to some more outcomes around particle size assessments in just a few minutes here. So we're transitioning to the results pertaining to the last kind of section of the survey, which is practices pertaining to the finishing phase. And again, we're really interested in this period due to the risks associated with feeding higher energy rations. So this is similar to the slide that you saw previously, but this is for finishing rations. So, our feed advisor respondents reported seeing much higher proportion of corn silage used in finishing rations, which is kind of expected, but also see a bit of diversification of feedstuff to provide roughage in the ration. Again, with corn silage use, we need to think about how much scratch that's offering the ration for rumen health purposes, and certainly even for those finishing rations. So we've done a bit of work around monitoring effective fiber levels in finishing rations, looking at particle size distribution. So it's nice to see some uptake here of objective monitoring practices here with the Penn State Shaker Box, for example. We still have considerable proportion of respondents that said they're not monitoring and solely depending on NDF levels as a monitoring tool. Certainly some opportunity here for a little bit more attention paid to effective fiber in those finishing rations too for rumen health purposes. Okay, Brent, and back over to you.
Yeah, we asked about frequency of feeding, just to sort of add to some of the comments Megan has said there. So sort of a typical response, I would say, but there again, it's something you should discuss with your feed advisor. So we, with our work last year and this year, we definitely saw that teasing the cattle to the feed bunk does increase dry matter intake. And of course, it's always ideal that if they make more visits, they have less consumption at each visit. But if they come more frequent, and that's much better for gut health. Next slide. The finishing ration, this graph, step up program involved with finishing cattle 39%, and the two-phase blended finishing ration at 28%, and same finishing ration used for the whole duration at 33%. Some of these numbers surprised me a bit, that only 40% of the feeders use a step up program involving finishing cattle. It's quite a step up to go from a medium roughage ration and higher grain to low roughage ration and high grain in a short period of time. So it's pretty risky to to try and avoid digestive upsets, and caution should be taken to the transition of the rumen to those high energy levels, as our panel discussion will address a bit later this evening. Megan?
Okay, I see, thanks Brent, I think, and I see Christoph's coming on, which means that our time is running low here. We're gonna wrap up here anyway, so just a note here that if you'd like to see or learn more about the survey and some of the survey results, we do have those results published in a Virtual Beef article that came out in December. So I think Christoph, Anita, and James have put together some proceedings, and that link will be included as part of those proceedings. We do have some other resources on some of the bunk management work, and those links and resources will be included in the proceedings as well for tonight. And then also these resources, same resources, are available through the Ontario Cattle Feeders Association's news feed. So if you'd like more information, certainly you can look to these resources. And just want to acknowledge the team on this. We really appreciated the collaboration with Ontario Corn-Fed Beef Program with Brent, and also the support from AWABA for the survey, and internal team members from AFRA, including Christoph and Michelle Linnington, and our team of summer students as well. So, and with that, we would be happy to answer any questions.